What if I told you that Microsoft and Apple might have engineered their own monopoly, and Congress is about to hand it to them in the form of a bill designed to protect children? The Parents Decide Act sounds reasonable on the surface. Age verification, parental controls, and keeping kids safe online. But the bill makes it technically impossible for Linux to exist in the United States, and Microsoft knows it. That's why they're staying silent while open source maintainers are in full panic mode. The Parents Decide Act was introduced on April 13, 2026. It's in the House Committee on Energy and Commerce right now. Co-sponsored by Democrat Josh Gottheimer and Republican Elise Stefanik, which gives it the appearance of reasonable bipartisan consensus. The core requirement is straightforward. Every operating system must verify your date of birth before you can use it. Windows, macOS, Android, iOS, Linux. Every distribution, every user, full stop. For anyone under 18, a parent or guardian must physically verify the age, government ID, biometrics, face scan. The FTC gets 180 days after passage to determine what counts as valid verification. App developers get mandatory access to that age data through an OS-level API. Every developer knows who's underage, who's not. That's enforcement at scale across the entire ecosystem. The bill language is written in a way that sounds neutral. Every operating system. But once you understand how different operating systems are built, you realize that neutrality is an illusion. The regulations that follow will determine everything, and Microsoft will write them. Microsoft probably didn't have to lobby hard for this bill. The bill was co-sponsored by Democrat Josh Gottheimer and Republican Elise Stefanik. That bipartisan cover gives it legitimacy. But look closer at the mechanics, and you see something that only benefits companies with existing centralized infrastructure. Microsoft's playbook. They already have a Microsoft account. Centralized. Already tracks identity, email, phone number. They've spent decades building government ID infrastructure, working with governments globally on compliance frameworks. Integrating age verification into Windows? It's an engineering project, not an architecture revolution. They have teams of thousands ready to handle it. The bill requires the FTC to establish enforcement guidelines within 180 days. This is where regulatory capture happens in plain sight. When the FTC publishes those guidelines, Microsoft's legal team, rooms full of them, will be there to argue interpretation, appeal denials, and shape the standards. Small companies can't do that. Open source projects definitely can't. What emerges won't be neutral regulations. They'll be regulations written by the people who can afford the most lawyers. Apple is in the same position. Centralized Apple ID. Legal war machine. They might prefer this bill because it raises the barriers to competition. Microsoft ships one update. Users get age verified. The compliance cost? Absorbed and passed to users through data collection. The competitive advantage? Permanent. Every alternative operating system now has to meet a compliance bar that only large corporations can clear. This isn't accidental protection. This is regulatory capture pretending to be child safety. Linux isn't a product. It's an ecosystem. There is no Linux company, no Linux board of directors, no Linux legal department. There are over 600 independently maintained distributions: Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, Debian, Linux Mint, and hundreds of smaller projects. Most are maintained by volunteers in their spare time. Ubuntu is backed by Canonical. Red Hat Linux has corporate support. But Arch? Volunteers? Linux Mint? Community maintained. Debian? A collective of volunteer developers with no centralized company structure. Now, the bill says every operating system must implement age verification. When the FTC enforcement guidelines drop, every volunteer maintainer faces a choice. Option 1. Build what Microsoft built, a centralized account system, government ID verification infrastructure, biometric handling, an API for developers, privacy documentation, legal compliance procedures. You're a volunteer with maybe 20 hours a week. You have no lawyers, you have no compliance budget, you can't do this. Option 2. Don't comply. Wait for the FTC to issue enforcement actions. Face civil penalties, possibly personal liability. Get sued while maintaining a free product you give away. Option 3. Shut down. Stop maintaining your distribution. Millions of users lose their preferred Linux flavor. This isn't a compliance problem. It's a structural impossibility. The bill doesn't distinguish between Microsoft and volunteers. It just says, comply or face consequences. There is no path for 600+ independent projects to comply. There never was. That's the trap. That's why Linux dies. You might be thinking, okay, but this is just a bill in committee. It probably won't pass. We'll see what happens. Wrong. California's Digital Age Assurance Act has already passed. It's not a proposed bill, it's the law. It takes effect in 2027, literally next year. And here's what it covers. Steam OS. All Linux distributions sold in California. Everything. California just criminalized any operating system that doesn't implement age verification. A Linux distribution that runs natively in California is now illegal to sell or distribute there. This is the preview. This is what happens when these bills become law. Colorado tried the same thing, introduced a state-level version. But after Linux advocates and open-source organizations started applying pressure, Colorado's legislature considered a narrow exemption for open-source operating systems. Keyword considered. The fact that they had to negotiate an exemption proves they understood the problem. If Linux could simply comply, why would you need an exemption? But the federal bill, H.R. 825, there's no exemption being discussed, no accommodation for the fact that Linux doesn't have a CEO to call, no recognition that volunteer projects can't hire lawyers. Once this passes federally, California's law becomes the baseline. Every state gets the same template. Every country watching US regulations sees what works. And Linux, unless Congress specifically exempts it, becomes technically illegal across the United States. That's not hyperbole. That's not speculation. That's what California is about to prove in real time. The FTC has to write the enforcement rules. And when they do, they won't be writing neutral rules for a neutral problem. The bill gives the FTC 180 days to determine what counts as valid age verification. That sounds procedural. It's not. Those guidelines will set the technical, legal, and business standards for the entire industry. Microsoft will have teams of lawyers at those FTC hearings. Apple will be there. Google will be there. They'll argue that valid verification means what their systems can efficiently implement. They'll lobby that the standards should be expensive to comply with, not as a conspiracy, but just as normal business practice. And then, what emerges won't be neutral rules. It'll be rules that only companies with massive infrastructure and legal resources can meet. This is regulatory capture. It happens in every industry. You set a rule, and the biggest players shape the rule to suit themselves. Healthcare did it, finance did it, telecommunications did it, tech is doing it right now. The pattern is always the same. The rule sounds neutral. Every operating system must verify age. Implementation requires massive compliance infrastructure. Only big companies can afford it. Competitors disappear. The market consolidates. Everyone pretends it was inevitable. With Linux, it's even cleaner. There's no Linux CEO to lobby, no Linux team at FTC hearings. Just volunteers hoping someone advocates for them. That's not a fight. That's surrender before the game starts. By the time the FTC publishes those guidelines in 180 days, the outcome is already decided. The only question is whether Linux gets a narrow exemption or gets eliminated entirely. The bill is sold as child protection, but it will destroy privacy-focused operating systems. Graphene OS is an Android fork maintained by privacy advocates. Their entire selling point is you can use this operating system without surrendering personal data to anyone. No forced account, no biometric tracking, no government ID on file, complete control over your device. Graphene OS has publicly stated Graphene OS will remain usable by anyone around the world without requiring personal information. That position is incompatible with the Parents Decide Act. If you can't require age verification, you don't comply. If you don't comply, you're illegal. When H.R. 8250 passes, Graphene OS becomes a crime to distribute in the United States. A privacy operating system gets destroyed by a law ostensibly about protecting children. This bill isn't about child safety. If it were, privacy-focused systems would get exemptions. Instead, they're explicitly targeted. This bill is about control. Control over data, control over who can build operating systems. Control consolidated in the hands of Microsoft, Apple, and Google, the only companies that can afford to be compliant. Privacy OS? Illegal? Open source OS? Illegal. The only legal operating system is one that collects data and turns it over to government ID systems and biometric services. One that feeds the compliance industrial complex. And nobody's fighting it because most people don't realize what's happening. If the bill passes, here's the likely timeline. Immediately, Microsoft and Apple issue compliant updates. Their users get age verified. Compliance cost? Absorbed? Competitive advantage? Permanent. They now have centralized control over age data, which becomes valuable for advertising and service recommendations. Their dominance increases. Within 180 days, FTC publishes enforcement guidelines. They're written with heavy input from the companies that can afford lawyers. The standards are technically complex and legally demanding. Expensive to comply with. Only large corporations can meet them. Within 6 to 12 months, Linux distributions start disappearing. Some get narrow carve-outs for non-commercial projects. Most face a choice: comply, impossible, or shut down. Arch Linux probably goes dark. Linux Mint disappears. Smaller distributions vanish entirely. Ubuntu might survive because Canonical has resources, but most of the ecosystem collapses. Within 18 to 24 months, California's law takes effect. States follow California's template. The US becomes a baseline for every other country. Linux maintainers worldwide have to decide, do we even support US users anymore? The outcome Windows and Mac OS market share increases dramatically, not because they're better, but because they're the only legal choice. Linux doesn't die in a day. It dies slowly. Distribution by distribution. Maintainer by maintainer. That's regulatory consolidation. That's how monopolies are built in the 21st century. This bill is a part of a larger pattern, and once you see the pattern, you'll see it everywhere. GDPR in Europe sounded neutral. Every company must protect user data equally. In practice, only Google, Facebook, and Microsoft had enough lawyers to navigate it. European startups got crushed. Consolidation accelerated. Healthcare regulations said every provider must meet the same standards. What emerged? Only large hospital systems could afford compliance. Small clinics disappeared. Market consolidated. The right to repair was supposed to help consumers. In practice, it required technical expertise and compliance infrastructure. Only big manufacturers could navigate it efficiently. The pattern, a rule that sounds neutral. Implementation that requires massive infrastructure. The market consolidates. The biggest players become bigger. And everyone says that's just how it is. This bill is that pattern, perfectly executed. It says every operating system must verify age. That sounds fair. But it's only fair if you already have the infrastructure. Microsoft? They have it. Apple? They have it. Linux? It's impossible. And once Linux is gone, the next mandate is easier. Security audits, privacy compliance, whatever comes next. Linux can't comply with anything once it's eliminated from the market. The FTC won't save you. They'll write the rules that Microsoft helped shape. Congress won't save you. They're already moving. The only chance is now, before the bill becomes law. If you want to stop this, here are the concrete actions. Contact Congress immediately. This bill is still in committee. H.R. 825. Tell your representative you oppose age verification mandates that would eliminate open source operating systems. Congressional offices track constituent pressure. 100 emails from your district create a paper trail that committee members see. Fund open source advocacy. The Free Software Foundation, Software Freedom Conservancy, and EFF are fighting this. They need money. They need visibility. These organizations are the only organized voice Linux has. Demand carve-outs. If the bill moves forward, demand an explicit exemption for non-commercial, volunteer-maintained open-source operating systems. Colorado got the conversation started. Push every state for the same. File comments with the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. The process is public. If you're a developer, your voice counts. You don't need to be a lawyer. You just need to explain why this bill breaks open source. Share this video. Make it clear this isn't a niche tech issue. It's about market consolidation. It's about whether you have choices in your operating system or whether you're forced into Microsoft or Apple. It's about whether privacy-focused systems can exist at all. The window is narrow. Once the bill reaches the floor, momentum is hard to stop. Once it's signed into law, the regulatory capture is irreversible. Act now or accept the outcome. Tech monopolies don't form through drama. They form through regulation that sounds reasonable. This bill might be one of those moments, but it doesn't have to be. Congress can fix it. States can add exemptions. Advocacy can work if enough people care, but only if you understand what's happening, not child protection. Regulatory consolidation? If you want to live in a world where you have choices, where you can use Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, where you control your data and your device, then this is your moment to act. Thanks for watching.